All right, welcome everybody. My name is Adam Hopler. You are here for a cross event between the law firm of Hopler, Wilms, and Hanna and Renaissance Funeral Home. I have with me Joe Smolenski. Joe, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Adam. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, just for some quick context for those who are with us today, I am an attorney with the law firm of Hopler, Wilms, and Hanna. I practice primarily in the areas of estate planning. So I'm working with folk, basic documents like wills, powers of attorney, trust on occasion, and looking forward to the end of things, incapacity, trying to help people plan for unfortunate events. Really exciting stuff. Joe also works within similar realms, and we'll get to that in a second. But just as context for me, I am from I live here in Durham. I have my wife and children. We've been here for, I guess, going on 14 years now. Been a resident of North Carolina my whole life, and been with this particular law firm as long as I've been an attorney. Really excited about what I do, despite the dramatic subject, or maybe even because of it. But really enjoy working with folk, trying to navigate these fairly complex issues. Yeah, Joe, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're coming from? Or I might even wonder like how you got into doing what it is you do, but go ahead.
Yeah. Really a family business. I mean, we began in the early 1900s. I'm fourth generation family funeral director. So as my dad was actually stating yesterday, it's really just in our blood. And it was a calling probably from the time I was born, because I did resist for a while, but ended up coming right here. And in 2003, we opened up Renaissance Funeral Home in Raleigh. But my family originates in New York, where they came in off the boat from Poland, my dad's side of the family. And this is our fourth funeral home, but currently our only funeral home here in Raleigh. So that's how we began. We opened our crematory early last year, and as we'll get into cremation in this webinar, that the Triangle has really embraced cremation, and we do mostly cremation and burial, green burial. We'll talk a little bit about that as well, and anatomical donation.
Excellent. Yeah. So we're going to have a little bit of back and forth today between myself and Joe. We have some, again, topics that we've each covered respectively that have a fair amount of crossover. And so we're going to, again, just give this a go. I will note that for those who are in attendance with us today, that there is a chat box off to the side that you should have access to. You'll see a couple comments already on there, but please feel free throughout our presentation to throw up comments or questions that you have. We are going to try and allocate some time towards the end of today, with about 10 minutes to go before 1, to pause and pull those up and see what we can do to address them. I'm pretty sure both Joe and I are be more than happy to talk with folks after the presentation. But certainly, if there are good questions, everybody can benefit from them. So we really encourage you to take advantage of that. We'll have folks kind of moderating throughout to kind of help keep track of all that for us. So with that being said, I'm going to do kind of a quick blitz for a moment through some fundamentals of estate planning. And then I'll get to a point where we have some crossover, and we're going to give it to Joe to kind of give us some further context into some topics that he can specifically hit on, and then we'll follow our conversation from there. But so let me, I guess, kind of focus us on for a moment these fundamentals of estate planning. And to begin with, let's see here, we're just going to highlight what are the critical estate planning documents. As I discussed very briefly, we have a last will and testament, and this document is primarily talking about assets and things that you have and what happens when you pass away to those things. It does also hit on things like guardianship, children, what happens to them and who will care for them if they're under the age of 18. a counterpart with a will can be a trust. And a trust can be a way for you to, again, to protect assets that can have actual living application. So that's why we call it a living trust. So you set it up while you're alive and it continues to survive after you pass. We have an advance directive, which that may come up in our conversations, but it is primarily focused on this very unique scenario. If you become incapacitated and can't tell us how you would want end of life decisions to be made. So this is your chance to say that in advance. And so again, this is a will, an expression of desire while you are alive, hence the use of the words living will, advance directive. The last two that you see mentioned here are powers of attorney. And in essence, these are documents that people can voluntarily enter into, naming another person to act on their behalf. And this concept is going to come up quite a bit, I'm pretty sure, in our conversation today. So I'll just kind of slow down for a minute on those two. But as I kind of discussed here, again, last will and testament, covered those points with you already. The living trust, it can be somewhat of a substitute, but it's a counterpart document to kind of help you move through that advanced directive. Again, it's a very specific scenario, but it's not the same thing as a will at all, even though it does use that word. People can get confused by that. So here we go, durable general power of attorney. So this is a way to plan for an instance of capacity. This particular document, the durable general power of attorney, focuses on financial matters. And that does have some ramification for us. But really, once you pass away, what you've done here with this document is you've named somebody else to act on your behalf, but they can't do that anymore after you pass. That's where your will comes into play. So this document may be helpful if you are trying to plan a loved one's funeral arrangements. You might use this authority to pay for that with a funeral home, which we'll talk more about. But again, once your loved one that you may be caring for, or if you're being cared for by somebody else that you pass, this document's no longer effective. And so, but it's only financial purposes. So the real kicker for us is this document right here. This is the healthcare power of attorney. So again, what we're talking about is agency authority, where you say, I want somebody else, my wife, my adult child, or maybe my parent, if you're a younger individual, I want them to act on my behalf when I'm not able to make decisions. And this document specifically only applies when you are actually incapacitated. And this makes a lot of sense because you wouldn't have somebody else scheduling your own doctor appointments if you're able to do that yourself. I wouldn't send my wife to a doctor appointment on my behalf trying to explain some kind of a rash that I have or a pain in my side. No, I'm going to go do that myself, right? But if I become incapacitated, then I would need somebody else to assist me to get me to where I need to be. So they are working, this agent, to help with medical decisions when I'm no longer able to do it. Now, it's really important that this document is done before you have any kind of incapacity, right? If you're waiting until you need this document to set it up, you've literally waited until it's too late. So this is not something that you hold off on because you're thinking it's not relevant yet. This is something that, like most of the documents that we've discussed, you want to go ahead and get them done early so that they're in place, and maybe you never need it. But if you do, it's going to be very critical and helpful for you. This document is different from the financial power of attorney in a pretty critical way. And that is that it survives after I pass. So if I name my wife to act as my agent, and she's managing my healthcare decisions and otherwise getting me where I need to be, etc., but then I pass away, she's still going to have certain decisions that need to be made. So there's a small list here. You can see organ donation, donating your body to science, and then general disposition of remains. And so that's a big one here, and that's really where Joe starts to come in, because if we don't have this document, then we're going to have backups. But before I get into that, I want to kind of pause here. I'm going to refocus our screen a little bit. Joe, I think this might be where it would help to kind of get some context for what it is that you do with folk when they come into a funeral home. A loved one has passed away. Maybe they have a healthcare power of attorney, maybe they don't. But either way, they're looking to you for guidance at this point. But yeah, I'll kind of pause here for a moment. Yeah, can you kind of pick us up with how things work from your end, and I'll kind of let you carry your presentation for a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi guys, thank you for joining us again. And just to pick up where Adam left off here, when a death has just happened, normally families don't understand the laws involved in paperwork and anything like that. So this is a really confusing time when they first arrive to the funeral home to make that arrangement with us. Some families have already pre-planned. Very few, though. I think the rate is somewhere around 15 to 20% of the population has already planned with a funeral home. So a majority of folks have never planned before. And when they come in, it's generally cremation that tends to be the more of the issue. And we're going to get into that in a minute. I'll explain why. And it really ties into exactly what Adam is saying. Before I get to that point, I want to give a brief background on some of the funeral industry and our history in America anyway. Really began with the European way of death. We finally developed our own way of dealing with death and disposition. Disposition, by the way, is what you choose for your final arrangements, meaning burial, cremation, anatomical donation, or entombment. Those are the only four ways in North Carolina anyway that you can be disposed of legally. So prior to the 1900s, furniture makers were also considered casket makers and funeral directors. In many areas of the United States, there was no license for funeral directors. Really, all they did was help families socially and emotionally in finalizing and getting the body to the burial ground. That was their main role. And it was during the Civil War that embalming was first introduced. Physicians or doctors were the first embalmers in the United States. When President Lincoln passed away, that is when embalming became publicized. Prior to that, most people hadn't heard of it, wouldn't have chosen it. It was just not part of the American culture in any way. So after President Lincoln passed away, more and more people began to realize, well, I have this option of preserving the body. I mean, you have to think about America during that time. We didn't have refrigeration. Electricity was, in some cases, just up and coming. There was no real great way to preserve a body. And if you had family that lived out of town, or you had family members in the North or in the South, and especially during the summertime, you wanted a way to preserve that body, even if it was just for a few days. And embalming was just a new technology that really helped people. And so it really caught fire in a sense, and almost everybody, or a majority of people, began embalming their loved ones. And we saw that really up until, I mean, even now we do, but the trend really started to decline in the 90s. And we'll talk more about that. One interesting fact, at least it was interesting to me, people have mentioned the word funeral parlor, which to me doesn't ring a bell. I've never associated any part of the funeral home with parlor. That's really an old term, but I did some research on it, and the parlor room of your home or your family's home was where the body was laid. And as you see in this picture here, when funeral homes finally became part of the culture, because they weren't, again, funeral directors just helped families having the viewing at the home and taking the body to the cemetery. Funeral homes became more and more popular into the mid 1900s. But prior to that, even in the 40s and even in the 50s, many people had the viewing right there in their home. And just like this picture shows, the flowers that were around the body generally were for masking odors. You know, they weren't necessarily there for beauty. They were there more for masking odors. And for the families that couldn't afford embalming, maybe it wasn't as necessary. But if you couldn't, more and more flowers might be seen there.
Wow.
That tradition has really carried on today as we give flowers. And some people say, well, why do we give flowers? That's really how it started. Many people don't realize that it was because of masking odors. So one of the choices that is more and more popular today is green burial. Many of you probably have heard it and don't know what it is. And this is one of those choices that I think more and more people need to be aware of, because we talked about embalming being popular up until the 90s and seeing a decline as more people wanted a natural way to go, or choosing cremation and not having a viewing in the traditional sense. This is one of those options that allows you to still have a burial if you don't agree with cremation without having embalming done. And as you can see with the bullet points here, no embalming, there is no cemetery vault. So in a sense, you're saving money too. I know for many, the financial part of funeral planning isn't something that you really want to consider, but you have to. And if you're not having to buy a cemetery vault, that's a huge savings right there, thousands of dollars. Only biodegradable material, so that casket, no longer are we using that expensive metal casket. We're using, in some cases, a shroud. And I will show you a picture of a shroud in a minute. The cemeteries generally are specialized, but sometimes a traditional cemetery will still allow what I'm describing here. We are lucky here in the Triangle. We have several green burial cemeteries. And if you have any questions about those, you can definitely contact me after. Here's a picture of a shroud. So yes, you can be buried in a shroud as opposed to a casket in these specialized cemeteries. Now, not every cemetery is going to allow this option, but this is one that green burial allows. So if you're not talking about a casket, you know, again, we're talking about savings as well. But the whole point of green burial isn't really from the financial point. It's really it's a way to save the environment. We're not putting chemicals into the ground. We're really performing disposition in the most natural sense. And this gives, in my opinion, gives so much meaning, because there's a lot more participation with family members when we go green burial, because of how simple it is. And it becomes more of a family event as opposed to simply having the funeral home do everything. And what I mean by that is many times these families will engage in dressing the body. They might even have a viewing at the home, which we could bring the casket to the house, such as this casket. And we've had families have a viewing at their home. It's not for everybody, but again, these are just options that exist. Here's a biodegradable casket made of seagrass. This is a cemetery in Wake Forest called Pine Forest. And this is what scene you might see just prior to walking down the path and going to the cemetery. And again, we talked about participation of the family. Here's where they walk by the wagon, side by side and behind, and follow us down the path to the green burial site. Instead of having the funeral home and cemetery staff carry off the body to the grave site, now we can have family and friends be part of that in a different sense. Okay, so here's a couple pictures. A pine box. We joke about, oh, just put me in a pine box. That's all I want. Well, there you go. There's your pine box. We've had many families who've built their own, perfectly fine. Just got to be solid, and we don't want any accidents with the body being in there. And the picture there to the right is what you might see if you were at a green burial cemetery. Although there are green burial cemeteries that look more like a field, this is more of a wooded setting, but both are still green. We're going to skip questions for the moment. Continue on. Cremation. So this is another option, the most popular option. Cremation is the process of reducing human remains to ashes. And what we really get after cremation is complete are bone fragments. Those bone fragments are then reduced to a powder. We call that powder ashes. In a sense, it's really not ashes. When you think about your fireplace and burning wood, and then what's left at the bottom, it literally is ashes. Unfortunately, really, your bone fragments are not ashes. It just looks like it. And the amount of time, it's 2 to 5 hours completion time. So fairly quick if you think about that. And it gets quite hot, and that's how we can accomplish it. One awesome thing about cremation, it allows so many options. All right, so you could still have a full funeral. You could still have a viewing, family present funeral with the body there at your church. You could have a viewing and visitation and funeral in separate days, and then have the cremation to follow. You could do it all in one day. You could just have the cremation first and then schedule services. Outside of services, here you see a picture of somebody scattering their loved one at sea. We hear this more and more often about people wanting their cremated remains being transformed into a plant or a tree. Here's a bios urn, which allows that. You choose different trees. Here is a way to place your cremated remains inside of a cement block and create a reef for the fish and wildlife in the oceans. This is actually done in Florida. That's the nearest place that I'm aware of. The salt urn there on the left, that's biodegradable, can go in water, can be buried in the earth either way. And the same thing with the one on the right, although it's made of more of paper, which would just easily biodegrade. The columbarium, many churches have these, cemeteries have these, and it allows a niche for the family to place an urn, sometimes 2 urns in one niche, and it almost looks like a giant gravestone. In a sense it is, with many people able to be in-urned and in-niched there. Just some quick facts on cremation. They're always performed individually. By law, it is not allowed, pets are allowed to be cremated in a community cremation, but the law does not allow humans to be cremated. So there's always that safety of doing one cremation at a time. So we know, and we know that your loved one was cremated. 65% of cremation, 65% of the triangle prefers cremation. And that number keeps going up. 2003, when we opened our doors in Raleigh, I believe we were around the 45% mark, maybe even less than that. And we're actually pushing closer to 70% at our funeral home. But as a whole, the triangle is probably around 65%. So now I'm going to tie in a little bit of what Adam was talking about, because cremation of all of the dispositions of the 4 of them. Again, that was burial, cremation, anatomical donation, and entombment. Of all 4 of them, this is the one specifically that requires the POA to be involved. If there is any sort of a family member that is, if there's any family members that are not going to come forward to sign the authorization, this is where the POA would really be helpful. So in North Carolina, we cannot perform a cremation without a signed death certificate by a doctor. So that is not something the family has to worry about. That is something that we do. And normally that's signed within a few days. Generally, not any quicker than that. And the cremation authorization is probably the most important piece here. So what happens is when a family decides they want to choose cremation, the family comes in, whether it's the surviving spouse or the children that come in. What most funeral homes are going to require is that if a surviving spouse is alive, that surviving spouse can sign the cremation authorization. If there is no surviving spouse, and you're talking about children being the survivors, that a majority of those children have to sign this authorization. Seems easy enough. However, if you think about 1 or 2 of your siblings maybe not agreeing with the cremation, or they live out of town and you are the one caring for mom or dad, that some issues can be posed here. And what the power of attorney document helps, it helps to take out any issues that might arise from anyone else in the family objecting to the cremation or not being available to sign that cremation authorization. So a power of attorney document is extremely important, specifically for cremation, because it is the only disposition that the law requires the family's permission to do so. For burial, for entombment, North Carolina does not require any sort of an authorization.
Yeah, Joe, let me, if it's all right with you, although, well, actually, no, let me hold. Go right ahead. Yeah, hit that.
Okay. So the cremation authorization is giving the funeral home permission to do the cremation. So unless it's signed, we don't do a cremation. And North Carolina funeral law will state that the spouse has the most authorizing power, then it's the children, then the parents of the deceased, then the siblings. So in that order, the degree of kinship order is what funeral law would have most funeral directors abide by. Now, there is also North Carolina law, which states that the POA has the right of disposition as long as the directive in that form, the directive has to be active. And that's what Adam can shed more light on, because we've had families who have had a power of attorney document saying, yeah, I've got the POA. I'm here to sign for my my dad's cremation authorization. I'm the only child, or I've got other siblings, or whatever the situation. And we look at that POA document and it doesn't have the directive in there, or the parent did not give anybody rights to make that decision. And I'm sorry, ma'am, this document is not going to allow what you thought it would. So this is one great piece of advice, is having the rights of disposition active for your survivors.
Yeah, excellent. And just for, I guess, our kind of our audience reference here for a moment, this is what Joe was just talking about a moment ago, that a healthcare directive is a very clear way to kind of put it into writing. This is what, if you want to have directions, like this is what I want to see happen, but at bare minimum saying, this is the person who has my authority to make this decision specifically about disposition, burial, cremation, entombment, anatomical donation, all of that. And so you can have that in a document that says, this is the person that I want to handle it. And if not him or her, then this person. And if not that person, then this person, and down the line. But like you said, there is a statutory ranking. And so you can see here that one thing that we would look to if we didn't have a healthcare power of attorney, and Joe, feel free to jump in, but I'm just kind of pulling this right from statute, is a pre-need funeral contract. So clearly if you had already paid for services and made those arrangements prior to your passing, we're going to honor those. I'm sure Joe could probably talk a lot about funeral trust requirements that go into play with those contracts. But kind of, we'll try to stay on task. But there are other kind of military forms that can be honored that are pretty unique circumstances. So we won't go into those, but that's a potential. And then, as he said, if you don't have that, technically there's an allowance for a statement witnessed by two people. But as you can imagine, that needs to be fairly specific. And, if you can have a person walk up to, as Joe described, a funeral home and have what appears to be a legal document, but it's not specific enough and it's already a power of attorney, because as I mentioned earlier, there's a financial power of attorney and a healthcare power of attorney. One deals with finances, but it doesn't really deal with healthcare decisions. So if you think you have power of attorney, the ability to make decisions over somebody else, but it's the wrong one, it can easily be kind of lose track on this. So it's not a good idea to bank on the statement witnessed by two people. Or maybe even a will, because wills can be subject to probate proceedings, and that can take time to approve. And so you put a funeral home into an awkward spot, asking them to go off of something other than what we just described there. And so more likely than not, you're going to be looking at this ranking: the spouse, the majority of reasonably locatable children. And who decides that? That's a good question. Surviving parents, majority of siblings, majority of a next class. And you can start realizing at this point how complicated it can get for somebody like Joe in the position of trying to gauge, is that what I have? Can I trust the word of the people who are in front of me? And so he's going to have a reasonably diligent responsibility to make sure, right? And so it's not uncommon on my end to be contacted by folk who are, as Joe said, not in agreement with their fellow siblings or their other next of kin. And they're trying to figure out who has the ability to make the decision. And it can be rather frustrating when you realize that it's a majority, and you kind of have to start lobbying essentially for agreement as to what's going to happen. So just the fact that that's the backup really begins to stress the importance of the front end planning with a healthcare power of attorney, making it clear just who's number one, who's number two, who's number three, who's number four, etc. But even going back, Joe, I don't know, I was really impressed upon by your presentation, the volume of options that a person has. So just in your short period of time here, you really highlighted a bunch of things that a person can do. And so it seems like it can be really important from a guidance standpoint for a person, not only just to think about, who's going to make the decision, 1, 2, 3, 4, but what decisions are being made, because that seems like a really personal decision. And I think that comes back a little bit about pre-need funeral contracts. And you mentioned that that's not something that people do a lot of. Is that right?
Yeah, I think there was a study done by the the NFDA, and it was somewhere around 18% roughly of people in the United States pre-plan, which really isn't many. And it's probably people that are on average around 80 years old. I mean, I've even talked to people who were in their 90s, and just said, hey, it might be a good idea to consider pre-planning, and they've completely rejected the idea. So it's really more of a mental thing than age. And we don't think about it, especially at my age and your age. We're not really thinking about it, but we do have some pre-need files that are people about our age, which I think requires a lot of forethought and trust that what you're doing is not preempting your death. It's just, you're doing what needs to be done. And you don't have to fund. That's another important thing for those who just don't have the financial means to pre-plan. You don't have to fund it. You can just simply come to the funeral home and get your plans down. That's one neat, really a quick way. You can go on the website that we have at rfhr.com. We've got a planning tool. Just make it easy. Understanding that it's not easy, but going back to that, what you were mentioning, not many people pre-plan. And when we have the families that pre-plan, there is such a relief from the family coming in. It's already done. They literally can walk in to the funeral home at the time of death with less stress and just basically say, well, what is it that mom or dad wanted? They look at it. Great. The money's there. Great. It's done. Now, if there's just anything that would be helpful, it would just be at least planning what you want. The financial means, maybe the deceased decided, you know what, the kids have to split it. I just don't have the means to do it. That can be figured out. It really can. Even if it comes down to reaching out to family and friends, a community, an organization to help fund it. But really important to get the plans down. If you do decide to fund it, it's not something that goes to the funeral. It's not an account or any sort of a financial investment tool or anything that goes to the funeral home and sits with us. It's actually a funeral trust. It's a trust that the funeral home is just a beneficiary of in the event of the death. You, the person who will eventually pass, or you, the planner, will be the owner of that account. And whether you have $100 to begin the funding of your funeral, or you have the whole thing paid in full, it's okay. But that's just one way to begin planning.
Yeah. So and Joe, as an attorney, I'm fairly familiar with the idea of like a trust account. We have similar things that come into play, not usually with estate planning, but it may be other areas of law. But that being said, so that is something, and I think that's critical, is still really that person's money in essence. You're holding it for their benefit, and that gives them the ability to come and pick it up and take it back and move it somewhere else. Is that right?
They can. Just like we were named the beneficiary of that trust, so can another funeral home. I think the biggest influence of that trust will be whether that was made a revocable or irrevocable contract. Revocable contracts being the type that could be liquidated in the future for another purpose or repurposed trust, or they're irrevocable, which basically can't be used for any other purpose but the funeral itself. And most people choose that because they realize that, well, I'm doing this for the future and I don't want the money going anywhere else. I want to guarantee that these plans of mine are going to get done. I don't want my kids liquidating anything. I don't want anyone coming in and changing my plans. I'm going to make this an irrevocable contract. And I would say 80 or higher percent contracts are irrevocable.
Yeah, and so I think in the same way as it works with attorneys, we have a licensing board that if I violate that trust, any attorney violates the trust, it affects my license, and I can't practice law anymore. So that's a big deal. You don't mess around with it. It's pretty similar for funeral homes as well, right? Like if because I know people might be concerned. I'm like, oh my goodness, if I give these people my money, how can I trust them? But it's your livelihood that's on the line for something like that, right?
Yeah, even more than that, though. Here in North Carolina, we are really lucky because the state has a governed board of funeral service.
Right.
Many states don't even have a board. So those articles you read and the news briefs about funeral home used pre-need funds to for whatever, it doesn't matter. Those are normally states that don't have a funeral board that watches and audits funeral homes for this sort of thing. But even a step beyond that, like I said, this is not a bank account that the funeral home has. This is a trust. Again, it's your account. It really has nothing to do with it. We can not touch it until the person has passed. So, but the other side of that was the funeral board, which audits every funeral home, every few years, goes through all of their files and makes sure that those funds that were said to be given and put into the trust are there, and we have to keep up with annual contract and trust increases. We have to show that in an Excel sheet or paper, however the funeral home decides to do it, but it has to be shown, visible, and sent to the funeral board every year. So we've got a clear list of how many pre-needs we have, how much money is geared towards or placed in these different trusts. And again, that's just a safety measure for the public. So it goes even beyond just trusting me. The board actually confirms with the family, and they have a copy of that contract, of that pre-need contract. So if there's an issue with our end as a funeral home, or we go out of business, we burn down, you move to another part of the state, you just take that contract with you. You can even literally move to another country. And as long as you've got that, you know how to access the funds in North Carolina, very easily just pay for the funeral that way.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good investment. I can speak from personal experience and from professional experience that funerals are probably the number one, in my mind, disruption after somebody passes.
Oh, yeah.
Suddenly having to go through these logistical processes and planning and coming up with ideas. You covered so much so quickly, but there's a lot of thought that goes into what you're going to do now that that's happened. And many people are just grieving. And, you know, then you might even have those issues of, well, who makes that decision and why did they make it? And other people calling into question, and that complicates things. And so it can be so much simpler when the person has taken the time and energy just to go ahead and tell everyone, this is it. Don't worry about it. I already got it locked down. Just execute, right? You know, so yeah, I think that a lot of what I do from a planning standpoint has nothing to do with the person that I'm sitting in front of, right? I'm helping them to do a will, a power of attorney, a healthcare power of attorney, whatever it is. But all of that is for the people around them. And it sounds like in a similar way, these pre-need contracts really have nothing to do with the person that you're talking to and everything about the people around them, that they're showing love to those individuals by doing this for them.
Yeah, absolutely right. And there's an ongoing joke in the funeral industry. It's a kind of just an infamous joke with us, is when people ask, well, how much does a funeral cost? I mean, for us, it's like, how much does a car cost? You know, what features are you getting? You know, are you getting leather seats? Are you not getting leather seats? Are you getting, you know, a two-seater? Are you getting a big SUV? You know, what are you getting? And that's kind of the same thing. So when people want to know, well, how much does a funeral cost? There's just so many options. You can go really simple, which would be the direct cremation or the anatomical donation, and that's it. Maybe no services, or services some distant time. And then you can go the full traditional route, which would be visitation, funeral, and burial. Burial at a family, maybe if you have a family plot or a farm somewhere. We've done. There's just so many things, and yeah, it can get complicated.
Absolutely. Well, let's see here. Quick thought before we get into questions, just because I think this might be interesting to talk through for just a minute. When I'm working through a healthcare power of attorney in particular, you know, I have a couple things towards the end on this particular subject that we'll ask people about, and they're very similar to what you just brought up, which is, all right, do you want your agent to make decisions about autopsy, organ donation, anatomical study, donating your body, and then the burial cremation question? And so really at base, it's just, you're good with your agent making those decisions. It's not making a plan. It's just giving authority so that, like you say, when you come in and or when that person comes into you and they say, I have it, you can read the document that says, yes, you were clearly given authority to make decisions about cremation, about burial, about all those other things that I just listed. But in terms of like progression, you know, my understanding, I'd be interested in your read on this, is that, you know, organ donation is one of those things that it's like, it's got to happen quick if it's going to happen at all. And many people can't do it because if you don't really die in a hospital, then you can't pull that up. And Joe, can you confirm that you can still hear and
Yes.
Okay.
Are you see my screen there? Okay.
I think you just have a internet connectivity, but you're still showing here, so that's good. Hopefully the video will pop back up here in a second. But so yeah, so you know, organ donation is either going to happen or it isn't. But you're still going to have that question of funeral or cremation after the fact. And then you have this anatomical study, and that is a little bit different. That's kind of like, you know, one example of that would be donating your body to science for the purpose of medical students to sort of get a feel for what it is to operate on a body. And so certainly in the medical field, people consider this to be an extreme benefit to science to be able to help raise and train a new generation. A lot of us just think of it as weird, but it can be very helpful. But my understanding is that even in those situations, often the body is eventually returned. And so I know that you distinguished between anatomical donation and the other three.
Yeah.
So how does that play in your experience? Is that a case where when the science has completed its task, that there might be a second disposition of cremation, burial, or what is your thought or experience?
Yeah, I can get into that. So I'm going to start with anatomical donation. So again, this was one of the 4 options you have, and anatomical donation is giving your body to science for use for a period of time, where then for most organizations that you donate your body to, there will be a cremation of your remains after they're complete, and then that urn will be sent to the family, or the cremated remains will be sent to the family at a later date upon completion. So the anatomical donation is really doesn't allow for you know, a full funeral in the sense where the body's there and a viewing. If there is somebody that wants to say goodbye to their loved one just prior to going to one of the local schools or other national organizations, that they have to be very timely with viewing that body very soon after death. Most of these schools, the local schools here like UNC, Duke, and ECU, they would like that body as soon as possible, but you do have to fit within the guidelines. Your body has to fit within the guidelines for acceptance. So even though it is an option, you always need a plan B. And I do have several pre-need accounts where folks have chosen anatomical donation, and we are involved simply because those schools do not supply transportation. They don't supply refrigeration of the body. They don't file death certificates. So at least on the document and the logistics, and the funeral home plays an important role. So if the death occurs on Friday, you might as well go ahead and plan that the death is going to occur on a Friday, and we're going to need refrigeration because it's better to just plan ahead than not. And basically, the funeral home has everything they need for knowing what to do for this person on file, and that's why we said plan ahead for this. That once the person has passed, we bring them to the funeral home from their place of death, whether that's a hospice facility, nursing facility, their own home. They come to the funeral home. We place them under refrigeration. We contact the school, and we coordinate transportation to the school ASAP, which whether that's the next morning or Monday morning or whenever. And if there is no pre-approval, you might still be able to donate your body or your loved one's body with a quick phone call. There's again, there is still an interview needed to decide whether or not you can be accepted. But even if you are accepted prior to death, you may still be rejected after death. So you have to, again, have your plan B. Most of the acceptances are going to be geared upon height, weight, and diseases. Weight is really important because they need to maneuver the bodies, between rooms, students, anywhere, and they just simply can't have someone that weighs too much. I believe the limit is somewhere around 200 pounds. It's roughly, give or take. We actually have a podcast coming up out next month about this exact topic, and that we'll post on our Facebook page. But regardless, have your plan B in place, because this will not always pan out the way it's supposed to.
That's very helpful. I've certainly had folk who have passion for that particular issue, wanting to see their body used beneficially in that way. I also have a lot of people who say, that's just weird, I want nothing to do with it. Don't allow the person to do that. And that's fine too. But it is interesting to see that by working with a funeral service for pre-need planning, you might actually increase your chances of successfully doing this, because the things that you discussed, that body preservation, because you don't know if you're going to pass on a weekend or in the middle of the week, and what effect that may have on your ability to actually follow through with what you wanted. Because I think most people that I've spoken to in the past, and so I'm learning something here, usually talk about working, and it may be not bad, but going directly to UNC or Duke and saying, I want to do this, and they walk them through that. It sounds like pre-approval request, but they're not considering the additional ramifications of, like you discussed, travel, body preservation, things of that sort. That's really fascinating to hear. Well, let's see here. I want to take a quick moment and just look through, because we're about 8 minutes to go, and I don't think I think most of our questions we've been able to kind of ping back answers on. There was one here that says, okay, if I have the signed correct forms, I don't need an actual attorney. And that's always good to have questions like that to kind of help clarify, because sometimes these forms, they use words that are not helpful. Like I discussed living will before, that can be very confusing. People think, is that the same thing as a last will and testament? And it's not. Same thing with power of attorney. So when we say this, we're going old school, the idea of an attorney as a representative, which is kind of where that word gets its meaning and its effect. And so as an attorney, I represent others. And so I, go through obviously processes with our state bar to get licensed to be able to do that legally. But a power of attorney is a similar concept of representation or agency. And so just because you have a power of attorney, that doesn't mean that you have to be an attorney, as we would use that word generally to have that authority. And it doesn't require the use of an attorney. It more means that if you are the person that a loved one names to be an agent, then you are given these powers, and we call them powers of attorney, representation of another person. So ideally, by having a power of attorney, you enable the people that you are entrusting to care for you to do that without an attorney. I guess is one way to think about that. So that's the hope, is that this enables you to do all the things that you need to do without having to involve our court system or encumber the process. Because as we've discussed a lot today, after somebody passes, going to somebody like Joe, any funeral home without these documents in place, they raise questions. And, you have to start getting answers that require interpretation of law. So like one of the slides we went through kind of showed the progression that you go through to determine who has authority, but that's a legal statement. And what it means that a person is reasonably locatable. That's a legal interpretation. And so people like Joe are reasonably careful in how they approach that. So you can help avoid awkwardness between yourself and others by planning in advance.
Yeah. And Adam, I'll just quickly just share a fact that if for some reason there isn't anybody immediately able to sign the cremation authorization, most funeral homes will, the law has two terms that depending on which the family fits into. One term is stating that the funeral home can wait 5 days or wait 10 days is the other one before the cremation can be done. So if the paperwork's not there that we need, the worst case scenario is we're going to be waiting 10 days after death before we do the cremation. And by no means can any funeral home or crematory do a cremation like that. There's always paperwork, approvals, authorizations that have to be set in place. And some people, we do get, good amount of folks who come in and say, okay, can I get those cremated remains tomorrow or in 2 days? No, it doesn't work that easy, unfortunately. I wish it did, but as you can tell, it's a very permanent disposition, and there's no reversing that.
Let's see here. Another question, and Joe, you might have hit a little bit on this one, but just to make sure we address it.
Yes.
It asks if funeral pre-planning is done and then you relocate. Is there a cost involved to transfer that plan to another location? So I guess the idea would be that if you had a pre-planned contract set up here in North Carolina and then you moved to Colorado, could you use money that you contributed or transfer that plan in Colorado? And is there going to be some kind of a fee associated with that?
No, I shouldn't say there's not going to be any, because if that state has some sort of, let's say they have a board of funeral service, and that board of funeral service has a filing fee. There could be, it may be minimal, but generally no, there's no transfer fee. Most funeral homes are willing to accept that pre-need. Now, there is the idea though that what funeral prices were settled on when you made the contract versus how far in advance in time this is now, and does that funeral home that you're going to have the same prices? There could be a change there, but you can also negotiate and say, hey, well, listen, I'm willing to bring my funeral services to you if you will honor this. There is some negotiation there, but so basically, no, there should not be any transfer fees, but there could be some other fees involved.
Right. Now, that would be very different from, and I don't think this is the question that was being asked, but, if you were in North Carolina, but your plan was to be buried in Colorado, there are probably going to be transportation costs in terms of getting.
Yeah, if that wasn't foreseen at the time, and now that's changed. Let's say burial was going to be here in Raleigh or the area, and now it's going to be in Colorado. Correct. We'll probably just have the additional flight fee along with the funeral home or the receiving business out there in Colorado, and that would be added to the funeral bill. Yes.
Yeah. And it looks like you answered one of our questions in the chat, which is awesome, about locking in with a prepay potential for inflation. And I think what that highlights, maybe it's a quick takeaway, is that these are contracts that, as you have stated in different ways, are negotiable. There are different things that you can ask for and agree to, and they will affect the price of what it is that you're asking for. And so it sounds like, just generally speaking, having somebody experienced, maybe somebody with 4 generations of experience, in helping you walk through a pre-need contract could be pretty helpful. Am I on pace with that?
Very, very agreed.
Yeah. And let's see here. Yeah, and so I think along that same concept, there was a question about whether money is refunded if a funeral is ultimately less than what was initially anticipated. So, that seems like an unusual circumstance, but
Yeah.
If that hypothetically happened where a person had prepaid more than what the funeral ultimately wound up costing, that money is returned, or how's that work?
Yeah. Yeah, Michael there, I saw that question, and whenever I get these types of questions, I'd say, well, I'd love to help. Let me look at the paperwork and I'll let you know. I mean, generally, there would be a refund to the family if the money accumulated in a standard contract. So I made reference to an inflation. So we talked about irrevocable and revocable. We talked about inflation, and now there's a standard: inflation or standard, irrevocable or revocable. Those are the options of these funeral trust contracts, and most people choose irrevocable, which means it's only these funds are only geared towards funeral expenses. So then the other option is, do you want it inflation proof or standard? And in North Carolina, if you choose a standard contract, that is where you're likely to see a refund back if the monies accumulated are more than the price of the funeral today. Inflation proof locks the price in place, and the funeral home does not have to give, if there is any overage in the account, that the funeral home does not have to give the family back that money, because that was the risk that the organization, the funeral home, took, whether there would be an overage or a shortfall in the account. And I've been doing this for 17 years, and I will tell you that most of the time it's pretty much split down the middle. I mean, you choose inflation proof if you just don't want to worry about money at all, and you choose standard if you're willing to take a chance. But as we know, with today's financial markets, most vehicles for investing, even trusts for funeral funds, are not earning a lot of money. I personally think that inflation proof is the best way to go right now, because you're putting the risk on the funeral home. But if you rather be the type that says, well, if there is any I want to pay, I'll have to pay the additional funds in the future, or I'll get the refund. But as far as this situation in particular, I totally wouldn't mind helping out. I could look at it. But in North Carolina, we're very safe here, and we have a lot of safety measures in place. I don't know if that was in another state, because that doesn't sound like something I would see here in North Carolina.
Well, we're at our hour mark, and I would certainly encourage folk, if you have additional questions about anything that you've heard here today, please definitely reach out. Both of our offices work hard to keep folk properly informed about legal issues, or in Joe's case, about the most recent in funeral options and planning. And so I think maybe as a quick synopsis, this is a great topic to be mindful of, to be thoughtful of, in terms of your loved ones and those that you leave behind one day. Making things less stressful, showing deliberate intent has a high value to folk who have just recently had a loss. So if this is a new topic, I hope this was helpful to you in thinking through the process and the issues that are to deal with. And certainly, even if you were aware of this prior, I hope this was helpful in kind of seeing the nuance that's available in planning and thinking through these. So, Joe, thank you so much for joining us here today. And I imagine we'll probably do similar things in the future.
Yes.
But yeah, thanks again for
absolutely enjoyed it. Thank you, Adam.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, for those who are on, this has been recorded. You can feel free to check it out again and review the information. For those of you who may review this later, again, thank you for your time. And so, with that, I will sign us off and wish everybody a happy rest of your day or weekend. But yeah, very good. Thank you so much.
Take care.
All right.